Hey, all right. We are now approaching the end of this here book, so we're going to talk through page 160 to the end. A lot of the section is action, right? So the hurricane is a coming, and Teacake and Jane decide that they were going to wait out the hurricane. And as they're in this little shack on the edge of the lake, right? It's a huge body of water. They start to talk, right? The power goes out and the lights go out, and it said, "Thank you, ma'am. This is tea cake. But supposing you was to die now, you wouldn't get mad at me for dragging you here? Now, we've been together around 2 years. If you can see the light at daybreak, you don't care if you die at dusk. It's so many people have never seen the light at all. I was fumbling around, and God, he opened the door." Now, which is a nice thing to say. But I mean, it's kind of the same idea as it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. If she had never met Tea Cake, she would still be back in Eatonville, right? But she wouldn't have had any of the fun and adventure and loving relationship that she's had over the last 2 years, and she'd probably be quite sad, right? So it's better to be in the situation with Tea Cake here, even though she's in a dangerous one with somebody she loves, than to be back home with nobody, right? So they decide to run, right? And they escape, and the water is up to their waist, and they keep going, and eventually they get to a place where it's dry ground, right? And Tea Cake sat down to rest, um, and Janie tried to grab a uh, piece of kind of like roofing, right, to kind of shield him from the rain and the water and kind of cover him up a little bit. Holding on to that, it was very windy, and she got carried into the water, right? No, in the water. This is a good scene, and if I was in class, I would draw you an excellent diagram of this. But so the cow is in the water, right? And Janie is holding on to the tail of the cow in the water. Standing on the back of the cow is a dog, right? I have some good life advice for you right now, and this is an important bit of life advice. And I can't promise that if you follow this, your life will be good, but I can pretty much promise that if you do not follow it, your life will not be good. Don't get rabies. I don't care how many kids want to. I don't care how many of the cool kids, how much peer pressure is involved. Don't get rabies, right? Now, if you get rabies, several things happen. One, the wound can heal, and rabies can be in you incubating for weeks, right, before you know anything's wrong. By the time you start to know things are wrong, you develop a very quick fever and chills, and you start to get aches, and several other things happen. You get these very painful throat spasms, right? So you can't swallow. So if you've ever seen a picture of like a dog with rabies and it's foaming at the mouth and all that saliva and stuff, it's because they can't swallow, right? And the other thing is they get terrified of water, right? Hydrophobia is another word for name for rabies. Now, the reason the dog is on the back of the cow is because the dog has rabies and the dog is scared of the water, right? So TK goes to rescue Janie, and in the process of killing the dog, he gets a bite from the dog, right? At first, he got a bite, it was in the face, and he was just glad that the dog did not bite his eye because wouldn't be able to see, obviously. If he had gotten his shots then, he would be okay, right? If you get rabies shots after you get the bite from an animal, you will be fine. The problem is if rabies is allowed to set in and develop before you can get the medicine for it, then you're in big trouble and you're probably going to die from it, which is what happens to TK. So after she rescues him, they make it through the storm, and TK initially is put to work burying the bodies of dead people. And when this book was published back in the 1930s, a lot of prominent African American writers said it didn't deal enough with racism. It wasn't a serious enough book. And partially because in Eatonville, as the first all African American community, there just wasn't a lot of white people, thus, not a lot of racism. Racism shows up a couple places in the book. This is one of them. And he's put to work by two white guys with guns. And first, they're supposed to examine the bodies to determine whether they are the body of an African American person, in which case they're supposed to be dumped into a big ditch. And if they were body of a white person, they're supposed to be put into a casket. But because of the bodies that they found, and this is gruesome, but we're all covered with mud and dirt and stuff because they've been in a hurricane, it was very difficult to tell. Now, the whole point of this scene is another example of why racism is terrible and ridiculous, right? We saw it with Mrs. Turner as well, who was racist against anyone whose skin color was darker than her own, but that's really about it of what we see for racism in the book. T-Cake escapes from this, gets back with Janie, and then they make it back to the muck, right? Now, once they get back to the muck, at first, um, Tea Cake's okay, right? And then he starts getting sicker and sicker. Um, so right around here, we are on at page 174 at the bottom. It said, "Give me a drink of water before you leave." Janie dipped up a glass of water and brought it to the bed. Teacake took it and filled his mouth and gagged horribly, disgorged that which was in his mouth and threw the glass upon the floor, and Janie was frantic with alarm. Now, this is the type of thing. There are a number of times throughout this section where we see different characteristics of rabies the teacake is exhibiting. This is one of them, right? Now, tea cake, when this happens, thinks there might be something wrong with the water, or maybe, the bucket she used to go out to the pump to get the water was dirty and it had mold in it or something, and it just tasted bad. But he just couldn't swallow, right? We get another example of that here. As soon as she was out of sight, tea cake got up and dumped the water bucket. Here we go. He tried to do it again. It was so good and cool. Come to think about it, he hadn't had a drink since yesterday. That was what he needed to give him an appetite for his beans. He found himself wanting it very much, so he threw back his head as he rushed the glass to his lips. But the demon was there before him, strangling, killing him quickly. It was a great relief to expel the water from his mouth, and he sprawled on the bed again and lay there shivering until Janie and the doctor arrived. The doctor says if he'd gotten his shots weeks ago, he'd be okay. But right now it's probably too late. And what the doctor wants to do is take tea cake to the hospital and tie him down. Another characteristic of rabies is once you start to hallucinate, you become very paranoid, right? And you think everything is trying to kill you, which is why rabid animals are so dangerous, right? And tea cake too. And so the doctor wanted to tie him down, and Janie did not want him to do that. And so the doctor said he would go and try to find the medicine that tea cake should have had weeks ago. Now, Janie can't tell tea cake all of this, right? So she just kind of tries to take care of him. And as she is taking care of him, she he got up and it said right here, "You keep that up, tea cake, and I'll believe you after a while." We're on page 181. Janie said archly and fixed him back in bed. It was then she felt the pistol under his pillow. It gave her a quick, ugly throb, but she didn't ask him about it since he didn't say. Never had tea cake slept with a pistol under his head before. Never mind out about the cleaning and round the front yard, he told her as she straightened up from fixing the bed. You stay where I can see you. Now, you can see Tea Cake is starting to act differently, right? This terrifies Janie, and because she knows that Tea Cake is probably not in his right mind. So she opened the pistol when Tea Cake went outside, and she removed all the bullets but one, and she put her rifle in the corner. Right now, we had those scenes where Tea Cake taught Janie to shoot, and they went shooting, and what a good shot Janie was, and that was to set up this. Right? If Janie had never used a gun before, for her to be able to, first of all, open and take the bullets out of the pistol, and then load the rifle and put it in the corner, and then after Tea Cake fires, on empty chamber a couple times and gets to the actual bullet, for her to be able to take the rifle, pull it into position and shoot him, she's got to know what she's doing, right? And on page 184, it said the pistol and the rifle rang out almost together. The pistol just enough after the rifle to seem its echo. TK crumpled as the bullet buried itself in the joist over Janie's head. Janie saw the look on his face and leaped forward as he crashed forward into her arms. She was trying to hover him as he closed his teeth in the flesh of her forearm. They came down heavily like that, Janie struggling to a sitting position and pried the dead TK's teeth from her arm. Now, I'm going to give Janie the benefit of the doubt here and assume that Janie went and got a rabies shot after Tea Cake died chomping on her arm, right? For her to have to pry his mouth open likely means that he broke the skin of her arm and then his saliva went into her body, which means she could have rabies. When I wrote my master's essay on this, one of the essays I read was written by a doctor suggesting that she had rabies at the end, right? So when she sees Tea Cake prancing around the treetops or whatever, that isn't just a nice memory that she's thinking about, but she's literally seeing him. And I got to give Janie more credit than that. If she had to shoot her husband who died of rabies, you'd think she would go get a rabies shot. Now, right here, last thing. She'd wanted him so much to live, and now he was dead. No hours, every eternity, but it has its right to weep, which is one of my favorite sentences in the book. Janie held his head tightly to her breast and wept and thanked him wordlessly for giving her the chance for loving service. Now, through this book, one of the arguments, things you can write about your paper, is the use of money, right? Nanny said to Janie, if you marry a man with wealth and land, you will be treated well. And what happens is the more money the husband has, the worse he treats her, right? When TK puts Janie's money in the bank and then assumes financial control, he starts to treat her worse, right? And so in the end, she does end up serving all husbands, right? She has to do the work that they ask her to do and go. She kind of, excuse me, do all the stuff that she asks him to do. But the difference here is loving service, right? Teacake did love her and was, for the most part, treated her very well. Then we have a weird scene with the jail and the trial. And one of the weirdest things is several things. We don't get to hear Janie speak. Janie's life is on the line, and as a result of that, we don't get to hear her words. This is something that some other prominent critics faulted the book for. Like, this is Janie's chance to speak her piece. And yet the narrator then kind of takes that over, and it just becomes narration as opposed to her saying the words. It's possible that for her to tell her story, she would just retell us the whole book that we've read already, and so that's kind of a waste of time. But either way, some people have problems with that. Other weird things: the judge sets up an option, and then the jury comes back with another option. Judge says either she is a cold-blooded murderer or a poor broken creature who had to do this. She's neither of those things, right? She definitely intentionally killed her husband, but not because she's a cold-blooded killer. And she's definitely not a poor broken creature. She saved her own life. And then the jury comes back with a third option, which is neither of those. We find that death of Virgil Woods to be entirely accidental and justifiable, and that no blame should rest on the defendant. Justifiable, perhaps. Accidental, definitely not. Right? We saw what happened. So then Janie comes back and goes back to Edenville, and we go back to the frame, and she's talking to Phoebe, right? I've talked in this about how this whole book is a message from Janie to Phoebe. Phoebe looked up to Janie as the mayor's wife. Sam, her husband, looked up to Joe as the mayor. Phoebe didn't really know the inside story of their marriage, and so all Janie was to her was this powerful, beautiful woman. But she didn't know that Joe treated her so badly, right? And all the bad stuff that Joe starts to do as he accumulates more money, Sam is the one to step up and defend him, right? And so the message here is that if Sam was more like Joe, he would probably be treating his wife Phoebe a lot more like Joe treated Janie, badly, right? So now, as a message from Janie to Phoebe, we see Phoebe's reaction. Now that's how it was, Phoebe. Just like I told you, I'm back home and I'm satisfied to be here. I done been to the horizon and back, and I can sit here in my own house and live by comparisons. This house ain't so absent of things like it used to be before TK come along. It's full of thoughts, especially that bedroom. Now, uh, she goes on. Now I know them sitters and talkers. These are the people on the porch that she walked by as she walked back into town at the very beginning of the book. It's going to worry their guts into fiddle strings till they find out what we've been talking about. That's all right, Phoebe. Tell them. They're going to make my ration because my love don't work like they love, if they ever had any. Then you must tell them that love ain't something like a grindstone that's the same thing everywhere and do the same thing to everything it touch. Love is like the sea. It's a moving thing, but still in all, it takes its shape from the shore it meets, and it's different from every shore. Now, Phoebe's reaction, knowing that she got the message here, Lord, Phoebe breathed out heavily. I done grown 10 feet higher from just listening to you, Janie. I ain't satisfied with myself no more. I means to make Sam take me fishing with him after this. Nobody better not criticize you in my hearing. Now, that make Sam take me fishing with him, that relates back to Teacake taking her fishing, and as we've seen through the book, when people take her fishing or teach her to fish, she's much more successful, and we return to that image at the very end. And when people are trying to give her the fish, it doesn't work as well, right? So Phoebe's going to start to make that proactive choice in her own life and make her husband start to do stuff for her. Now, Phoebe, don't feel too mean with them because they're parched up from not knowing things. The meat skin has got to rattle to make out they's alive. Let them consolate themselves with talk. Of course, talking don't amount to a hill of beans when you can't do nothing else. And listening to that kind of talk is like opening your mouth and letting the moon shine down your throat. It's a known fact, Phoebe. You got to go there to know there. Your papa and your mom and nobody else can't tell you and show you. Two things everybody got to do for themselves. They got to go to God and they got to find out about living for themselves. Now, Phoebe goes home, and then in the end, we end with some fishing imagery. And Janie, while she's not happy she lost her husband, I feel like she's satisfied with her life, and there's at least an optimistic outlook going forward. Then Teacake came prancing around her where she was, and the song of the sigh flew out of the window and lit in the top of the pine trees. Teacake with the sun for a shawl, of course he wasn't dead. He could never be dead, and till she herself had finished feeling and thinking. The kiss of his memory made pictures of love and light against the wall. Here was peace. She pulled in her horizon like a great fishnet, pulled it in from around the waist of the world, and draped it over her shoulder. So much of life in its meshes, she called in her soul to come and see. And that's it. You made it through another classic book. So tomorrow we'll start talking about the test and those things. If you have questions, please let me know. Thank you.